Good evening. My name is Andrea Barnwell Brownlee, and I am the Director and CEO of the Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens. Welcome to LiterARTure. 111 people have registered for this important conversation, and I'm so happy to be with you all tonight. It's my real sincere pleasure to welcome so many of you. I know we have some people that have been here on many occasions, and we have some first-time visitors as well. But all I can say is you're in for an extraordinary treat. So as you all know, this is an incredible and important virtual series. LiterARTure is both a book club and an art club and explores coping with this crazy pandemic. Cindy Edelman is an art lecturer, and Stacey Goldring is the author, offering perspective and solace at this moment, as well as refuge within the pages of books and painted artworks. The Cummer Museum is so privileged and proud of this partnership. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to let you all know that if you would like additional information, you can certainly click the link that Emily has so graciously included in the chat. And we look forward to our conversation. So again, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you all to Cindy and Stacey.
Thank you, Andrea. Good evening, everybody. I wish we were all together in the Cummer Museum, but alas, the pandemic has prevented that. I want to welcome you to LiterARTure's third presentation in our Cummer series. Tonight, we're straying from coping with COVID and 19th century British art and literature, and we're sharing our Holocaust Remembrance presentation. Tonight's topic is Stolen Yet Found, Remembering the Holocaust Through Photography and Poetry. Before we get started, Stacey and I thought it would be worthwhile to share some thoughts about our entry into tonight's topic. Why have we both separately and together lectured and taught for years on Holocaust art and literature? What is it in our DNA? Let's don't ask our husband, Stacey. What is it in our DNA that speaks to us about one of the most horrific times in our people's history? What drives me to collect Holocaust art? I didn't grow up in a home that lost immediate family members. However, when I was 12, there was a confluence of factors. A very dear Sunday school teacher, Gerda Schwartz of blessed memory, whose tattooed arm prompted many questions. Further, my first reading of the diary of Anne Frank was about the same time, and that combined with a very graphic Holocaust documentary film called Let My People Go, which showed skeletons in wheelbarrows, lots of skeletons piled high. And that made, both of those made indelible impressions. And finally, my Rabbi James Wax, I've spoken about him many times. He was the one who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King and the garbage strikers in Memphis, where we grew up. He had been to Europe and he had seen some of the concentration camps. And as you can imagine, the experience informed his sermons, including his quest that we live a life in service of those less fortunate. And that really made a deep impression on me and my two sisters, imbuing in us a strong strain of social justice, which has remained. Next, please. Memory, art, individual and collective responses. Each one of those descriptors relates to the hero of tonight's Holocaust art story, the man you see on the screen, Henryk Ross, whose quote just hints at his indomitable spirit and sheer will. I don't know, can everybody read the quote? Because it looks like we're covering the quote. Okay. Ross's contribution to the understanding of the Holocaust includes one of the largest and most complete records of life as a Nazi captive in the 1940s through pictures and firsthand accounts. And by sharing his story and his photographs, we honor his memory and literally the thousands and thousands he photographed on this belated commemoration of Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah. Shoah in Hebrew translates or means catastrophe or utter destruction. And it refers to the atrocities that were committed against the Jewish people by Hitler, the Nazis, and their numerous collaborators during World War II. Shoah, also known as the Holocaust, Holocaust is a Greek word meaning sacrifice by fire or burnt whole. So the Holocaust was the largest expression of anti-Semitism in recent history. I will, as an aside, we've certainly been experiencing plenty of anti-Semitism in this country recently, but that's saved for another time. Yom HaShoah reminds us of the horrors that Jews and other persecuted groups faced: forced labor, starvation, humiliation, diseases, torture, often resulting in death. The Holocaust was a total systematic genocidal effort to wipe out an entire population from the face of the earth. We're going to see the impact of the Shoah on Henryk Ross. He and his wife, Stefania, were among the lucky ones. They were the rare survivors of 4 years in hell, and not one of the 6 million who were brutally wiped out. His life, his survival, and the subsequent images are nothing short of miraculous. And his place in history, the photos we're examining, played a major role in the conviction of one of the most notorious criminals, the infamous Adolf Eichmann. Next, please. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, in September of 1939, Henryk Ross was one of more than 3 million Polish Jews. Our story, or his story, took place in Lodz. Now it's spelled L-O-D-Z, Lodz, but in Polish it's pronounced Łódź, and in Yiddish, Lodz, and I'm going to stick with the Yiddish tonight. Lodz was 75 miles southwest of Warsaw, and it was the textile capital of Poland. In early 1940, the Nazis set up a ghetto in Lodz, rounding up about 164,000 Jews, which was more than a third of the city's entire population. And it forced them into the industrial part of the industrial section, or the industrial part of the city, which was about 1.6 square mile space. So 164,000 crammed into this, very unspeakable space and appalling conditions. And it was specifically intended, ghettos were set up by the Nazis specifically intended to isolate and seclude them from the rest of the population. And as I said, these conditions were just dreadful. They were unspeakable. No running water, no sewage system, overcrowded conditions, 8 to 10 people in a room, hard labor, and of course, starvation. It was deliberate starvation. In fact, in Lodz, 20% of the prisoners died of starvation, and that's from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum research. So you're looking at, on the left, one of the largest synagogues in Lodz. There were 7 large synagogues and hundreds of smaller prayer houses. This synagogue was built in 1861. When I hear 1861, I think about the Civil War, but this gorgeous synagogue was being built in Poland. This was the oldest, the Stara, and the Nazis burned it to the ground almost exactly a year after Kristallnacht. So November of 1939 was when this synagogue was destroyed. And so we're fortunate that we have this photo of it, because you'll notice the horseshoe arches and the striped or banded marble on the facade is reminiscent of Sephardic synagogue architecture called Moorish Revival, which really is inspired by ancient Islamic art that had made it to Spain, ancient Spain, as well as some Indo-Asian styles. And then, of course, you see the rubble of all the synagogues were destroyed at that time. Next, please. So here's here are two identification cards of our hero, Henryk Ross. You'll notice that the one on the left is from 1938, before he entered the ghetto. And then on the right, 3 years later, 1941, after he had been there a year. And Henryk Ross was born in Warsaw in 1910, and he worked in Lodz as a sports and press photographer before World War II. He arrived in the ghetto when he was around 30 years of age with his camera, which was originally confiscated because the Nazis had banned Jews from even taking photographs. But he was very skilled, and he was a professional photographer. So we'll soon see some images where we'll soon see that he was hired or placed into labor to be an official photographer of the ghetto. I want to just ask you all a question. Can you see the difference 3 years make in the photos of Mr. Ross in terms of his face and in terms of the gauntness and the weight loss? By the end of 1944, he shed 85 pounds, from life in the ghetto. Next, please. In all ghettos, the Nazis, with their typical cruelty, formed Jewish councils. That is, Jews who lived within the ghetto, who oversaw the ghetto community on behalf of the city's German Food and Economy Office, Ghetto Division. These councils were called Judenrat, and Jews ran the ghetto. They had their own police, they had their own fire brigade, they had their own currency. Of course, it was totally useless and worthless. And they had a post office. On the left slide, you see a stamp that has the head of the elder of the Judenrat, the man who was in charge, and his name is below, Chaim Mordecai Rumkowski. And we're going to talk about him a little bit later, but he was the person who worked with his Nazi counterpart, who was named Hans Beboff, who you see in the slide on the right, on the photograph on the right. And Rumkowski, the Jewish elder of the Judenrat, devised this theory, which was that if he made the ghetto as productive as possible, that Jews would have a greater chance of survival, and had a slogan, which was, quote, "Our only path to survival is through work." And the moral dilemmas here of leading a Judenrat or working with the Nazis were akin to basically dealing with the devil, because in the end, 95% who lived in the ghettos either died in the ghetto or were shipped in a cattle car to places like Auschwitz. So his existence, he was just a very tortured soul. Next, please. So here you see Ross, and he was taking a photo. He was taking identity card photos of Jews, and he was hired to be an official staff photographer within, you'll love this, the Jewish Statistics Office, which was part of the Judenrat, and which meant that people who worked for them received extra rations, especially, watered down soup. And there was another young Jewish photographer named Mendel Grossman, who also worked with Ross. And they both took official Nazi photos, documented industrial productivity of the Jewish labor, and photos like you see on the screen. And what's interesting is in these capacities, they had access to extra film and the processing facilities within the Lodz ghetto. And in this Ross photograph, you see that he's just so clever, because he built these platforms with dividers so that he could save his film, because what he did was he would take a photo, one photo of what do we see, like at least 7, 8, 9, at least 10 people here, and then he would cut them up. So he didn't have to use all his entire roll of 35 millimeter film, and he could stockpile the film to take more unsanctioned photos. So he perfected a technique of taking photos that he would have been killed if he had been caught. And if we were together, I would have worn a trench coat, because I've seen a documentary film of Ross where he's wearing this, he's got his camera around his neck and he's wearing a trench coat, and he has someone who is looking out for police or Nazis. And what he does is he quickly determines what he's going to shoot, opens his coat, takes the photo, and quickly shuts the coat. So he did that quite a bit, and you're going to see some examples momentarily. And his wife was one of his lookouts. And so he began as an act of resistance. He began documenting Jewish life, in particular the indignities that Jews were subjected to: beatings, hangings, dead lying in the streets, dead in their beds, other horrific scenes. And he also photographed Jews who were the beneficiaries of special favors, people like himself. And the overarching message here is that he wanted to bring a comprehensive account to his work, no matter the cost, to himself or to his wife. They didn't have children until much later. He wanted to defy the Nazis, and he was really willing to die for it. I mean, he was willing to take that risk, and he had to have been just so lucky. He had to have had some better angels on his shoulders. Now, the next couple of next, please, dear Hannah. The next slides are propaganda shots made by Ross. There were about 100 factories in the ghetto, and Jews were forced into slave labor. They made boots for the German army and uniforms, and they made mattresses. And the mattresses were filled with wood shavings that were so fine, they were as fine as wool. And here you see some of the women making the covers for the mattresses. Okay, and we're going to just flip through the next couple, if you would, thank you. And here you have the Textile Department. Honestly, I've never seen so many men at a sewing machine. I'm sure none of us have. And I was reading that some of these men were, professional attorneys and other professional jobs, that accountants and so forth. And they were put to work, and it didn't matter if they didn't know how to sew. They learned very quickly. And these photos were supposed to show how orderly the productivity was. And then the next slide is men hauling bread. And Ross said about this, quote, "We received a loaf of bread for 8 days." That's like 8 to 10 people in one room. They received a loaf of bread for 8 days. Apart from this, there were food rations in small quantities, which sometimes were rotten. Sometimes they were fed frozen cabbage that was just perfectly, miserable, dreadful. And he goes on to say those who worked received an extra ration of soup, but it was 95% water. And he goes on to say people either swelled up from hunger or became emaciated. And it's just, it was just a very, very difficult living conditions. Excuse me. Next, please. But Ross also took thousands. I mean, we're going near the end of our conversation tonight, you'll learn that he took 6,000 images. And so he took thousands of photos that were unofficial photos that commemorated life in the ghetto, including his own marriage in 1941 that you see on the screen, where the bride and groom stand under a chuppah, surrounded by friends and loving people. He managed to find beauty and calm moments, even amidst the suffering, and capturing those moments whenever he had an opportunity. And if you'll go to the next one, this is an example of the contact sheet of some of his photos that show the joy and the love and the normalcy that, you know, people craved when they were having to endure these kind of conditions that were just heinous. They were horrible. But you see a young girl reading a book, and you see couples, and you see mothers and babies, and you see families gathered together, generations. And so everything in these studies of children playing and families celebrating special occasions to couples in love. And here's what's striking about these, that these figures are endowed with grace, they're endowed with dignity and self-worth. And, you know, again, if he had been caught taking any of these, his camera would have been, that would have been the end of him and his family. Can we go please to the next? According to Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, the people, like you see in this particular slide, in these pictures smile. You know, they're handsome and they're very well dressed and they seem healthy and happy. But taken in the hell that we know was Lodz, it is hard to believe that the pictures were, you know, like this were possible. They don't reconcile with the environment in which they were taken, and they're truly deceptive. They make it seem as though the conditions in the ghetto hadn't been so bad. If these well-fed, well-dressed, healthy, and happy people were joyful. I think it's important to point out that these photographs stand in stark contrast to the reality that the majority of the ghetto inmates faced. And there are many unanswered questions for us. For instance, the question, why? Why did Ross take these? I think I've really made a stab at answering that. But, you know, did he take them for friends? It's possible. Did he take them for money? Well, I don't know. We don't know that. Perhaps they were a way of recording one's dignity. That seems a really strong possibility. We'll never know. But we do know that our job is not to judge Henryk Ross, because like all other victims, he did the best he could under the terrible circumstances he was forced to endure. Excuse me. Next, please. Here's that intimate moment that he caught on film. And then the next. And here's an example of a festive occasion. And Stacey and I have gone back and forth about what was being celebrated. You know, first we thought maybe it was Shabbat, but then we both are not the best. We both don't possess the best eyesight, so we were really straining, and we saw that there was at least 3, maybe 4 candles. So I'm going with Hanukkah. Now, thus far, excuse me. Sorry. Thus far, we've seen images of German propaganda, scenes of how ghetto privileged lived, and now we're going to see some of the raw images. Many of them speak for themselves, but let's go to the next. And this one's really hard to talk about. Women and men removing feces from the ghetto. You know, at the same time that Ross was taking some of his other photos, he secretly documented the grim realities of life in Lodz. Whereas as the war progressed, living conditions went from bad to worse. Excuse me. Here you're seeing the ghetto's fecal workers charged with pulling carts that held barrels of human excrement. This was an incredibly dangerous job because pushing the carts that moved feces out of the ghetto often led to death by typhus and many other fatal diseases. And, you know, It's so horrific. And if you look at the feet of the women in the front of this wagon, you'll see the figure on the far um, on the far end away from us. It only has one shoe, and the woman in the foreground is her feet are wrapped in rags, and you can only imagine, just the enormity and the burden of this task, uh, and the danger and just everything. It was some of these, um, you know, some of these tasks are just too tough to imagine. And this actually speaks for itself. Let's go to the next, please. By January 1942, the Germans started deportations to a camp about 30 miles from Lodz, and it was called Shelmano. And Shelmano, the means of extermination were uh, vans that were had gas. So uh, uh, this photo that Ross took shows a mother and two sons who were separated. It is my understanding from the research that I did that the mother was being deported first and then the two boys later. And you can only imagine if you're a mother and you're looking at this barbed wire fence, and these are the last words that you're going to be saying to your children the last time you'll see them. It is one of the most poignant of images that he took. And it's especially the way the hands of the young boys are reaching up and out toward their mother. Her hands are grasping the fence. And I noticed too, after looking at this so many times, there's a man standing beside her with a hat. And I presuming it's a man. Ross testified that in the year 1940, it was still not known where the transports were going to. But in 1941, at the time of further deportations, the Jews began to make inquiries, and it became known to them that they were going into the, quote, frying pan. This was a routine expression of the people in the ghetto. They knew they were going to be burned, and they used to call it going into the frying pan. And as Stacey so lovingly reminded me the other day, that this is what happens when we don't stand up to bullies, or when we don't stand up to liars, or we don't stand up to injustice when we hear it or when we see it. Next, please. So this particular image of children being driven to Shelmano, to their deaths, is so painful to describe, as it represents evil in all of its forms. In 1942, Nazis demanded that Mr. Rumkowski, the elder of Lodz, arrange for the deportation of 20,000 children, elderly and sick, to Shelmano. And he did this in a manner that has really marked him for eternity, if you will. He delivered a speech called "Give Me Your Children." I mean, he apparently had the Nazis had come in and they said they needed 20,000 children, sick and elderly, and people ignored it. And so they forced Rumkowski to make this speech and to help go into their homes and pull them out and throw them on either wagons like this or in cattle cars. They were taken to Shelmano. They were immediately gassed in vans. And this number included every child under 10 years of age. And there were about 6,000, slightly less than 6,000 of them. It's just incomprehensible. And in the summer of 1944, Rumkowski and his family were on the last transport to Auschwitz from Lodz. And when the Lodz group got off the train, Lodz inmates who had survived up to that point were waiting for him. And soon after he arrived, he was brutally beaten to death by some of the Jewish Sonderkommandos inmates as revenge for what he had done to their children. Right, next. And I know I've got to wrap it up. I'm almost done. Right? Stacey, if you haven't taken your glasses off yet. Okay. Ross secretly photographed a crowd of Lodz Jews being ushered on a train onto a cattle car. And he described this as, it's really quite fascinating. He said, quote, "People with whom I was acquainted worked at the railway station of Radogosht, which was outside the ghetto but linked to it, and where the trains destined for Auschwitz were standing. On one occasion, I managed to get into the railway station into the guise of a cleaner. My friends shut me into a cement storeroom. I was there from 6 in the morning until 7 in the evening, until the Germans went away and the transport departed. I watched as the transport left. I heard shouts. I saw the beatings. I saw how they were shooting at them, how they were murdering them, those who refused to get on. Through a hole in a board in the wall of the storeroom, I took several pictures, and this is one of those pictures. Next. After Lodz was liquidated in August of 1944, 60,000 Jews and Roma, because there were about 40,000 Roma or gypsies who had also been brought into Lodz. They were sent to Auschwitz, leaving behind their food pails. So as a personal aside, I just want to comment on these food pails. About 23 years ago, my husband Dan and I saw related examples when we went to Auschwitz. Building after building with vitrines piled high with suitcases, eyeglasses, shoes, human hair, children's clothes, and combs, personal items that Jews brought thinking they were going to be resettled, and of course they weren't. And wrapping one's mind around numbers when it comes to the Holocaust is unfathomable. However, when presented with objects such as the one we're seeing on the screen, they bear witness to the suffering and the scale and the death of those who use them. They're personal and they represent humanity, and they should move us. Ross and his wife were part of a cleanup crew of 877 Jews that were left in Lodz after everyone else had been deported. True to their sick minds, Nazis were sure that the Jews had left their treasures in their homes and their table legs, buried in all kinds of places, and that's why they needed cleanup help. The Nazis had already dug a burial pit outside the ghetto where they had planned to eliminate the cleanup crew, but the Soviet army had other plans. Next, please, Hannah. In the fall of 1944, Ross knew that the Germans were shutting down the ghetto, and fearing imminent death, he buried, as I said, 6,000 negatives in canisters in a box that you see on the screen, and placed them in a wooden container lined with tar by his home. Then the Red Army arrived in Lodz in 1945 in January, liberating the ghetto. And shortly thereafter, in March of the same year, Ross unearthed the box, as you see in the slide, and about half of them had been severely water damaged, but approximately 3,000 of them survived. And after the war, Ross testified at the Eichmann trial. He and his wife moved to Israel in 1956, and then 5 years later was the trial. And Henryk Ross died in 1991 at the age of 81, and photography absolutely saved him and saved his life. Next, please. There's the slide of the Eichmann trial and the prosecutor holding some of Ross's photos. Next, please. And I love this image that Ross took early on in his stay in the ghetto. This inspires us as we see a Jew holding a Torah scroll, which is the most sacred of all objects to us. And can we go to the last slide, please? As we think about Ross, and I've been thinking about how to close tonight, and I was so, it was just shared that, the George Floyd conviction, murder conviction happened yesterday. So as we think about Ross and his understanding of the value of documenting history, and his photographs serve as a reminder of photography's ability to create meaning. And when we compare him to today's world, where we are bombarded with visual imagery, often of horrifying images, such as the brutal murder of a Black man by Derek Chauvin, it is profound that a teenage girl, Darnella Frazier, had the presence of mind to record George Floyd's unconscionable killing for all the world to see. And that act connected the crime to the rest of the entire world, alleviating our alienation, because we've been so used to seeing these horrible photos from Africa, from Syria, from places all over the world where there's suffering and hatred. And so just think what would have happened if the recording hadn't existed. Well, I don't want to think that long. This young Black girl took a risk, just like Henryk Ross, and the consequences have been remarkable. Ross, whose mission provided plenty of evidence of life in a Nazi ghetto, displayed the complexity and range of his circumstances. We now see that photographs and the iPhone and recordings can change history. It did so 80 years ago, and it does today. As we honor and remember Henryk Ross, let us also salute Darnella Frazier for her bravery and for reminding us that it is our duty to stand up to injustice in any form. And I'll close with Elie Wiesel. The late Elie Wiesel spoke to this sentiment when he said, quote, "I swore never to be silent, and whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation, we must always take sides." So as we go about our daily lives after tonight, may we all be challenged to live like Darnella and be vigilant in the face of any and all kinds of racism. Thank you very much. Now we're going to be inspired by the masterful translator of Avraham Sutzkever, Stacey Goldring.
Cindy, that was beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know, it seems both of us had our life-changing moments about capturing stories about the Holocaust when we were rather young. For me, it was babysitting at my cousin's house. After my little cousins were all tucked into bed, I remember going over to a bookshelf and just pulling off a book. And I just started leafing through the pages. Maybe I was, I don't know, 12, 13, whatever. I remember opening the book and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There were these black and white photos, these with piles of tangled dead bodies. And it was like a grotesque horror. I could not look away. And nor could I understand it. I couldn't put words to it. And I remember going home that night, opening the sliding glass door, walking through the backyard, hopping the fence, and making my way in the street, across the street to our house, and thinking, I'm not safe. I better be on my guard. And then a few years later, remember that TV series with Meryl Streep and James Woods. It was called The Holocaust. And that really educated America. I think that was like 78, 79-ish. Well, from then on, my identity as a Jewish girl was strangled, saddled, and twisted inextricably with these horrors of these images I can't even pronounce, and what they represented. So anyway, that night, it lit an urgency in me to capture and tell true stories of the effects of the Holocaust. And so that is what I do today with my pencil sharpened. And tonight also, it seems whenever we do these literature events, Cindy, which are such a joy, I have always a confession. So tonight, another confession. It actually wasn't until 2016 that I ever even heard of Avraham Sutzkever. That summer, while co-creating a course about memory of the Holocaust at the University of Florida, myself and two amazing professors, doctors Rebecca Jefferson and Codelin Rotz, we were selecting just the right literary works to present to our students through a course that we did at the Isser and Ray Price Library of Judaica. It's a beautiful sacred space. And I'm sure writers like, next slide, please, like Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel and Viktor Frankl come to mind. And Hannah, if you could switch it to the, yeah, there you go. Maybe some of these titles look familiar. And I must tell you, I was in seventh heaven because I was tapping the minds of these great, super uber smart people, not only Rebecca and Kati, but in addition, we tapped the English department, social studies, Judaic studies, wasn't social studies, Judaic studies, and also the journalism department. So with the next slide, we created an outstanding syllabus that did include Levi, but also Theodor Adorno, which you see on your right, and Paul Celan. And then we also had this poet, Avraham Sutzkever, who we can see on the next slide. And by the way, I must say that the course was incredible, and time permitting, I hope to bring it back to UF and other campuses because it is vital and relevant to explore Holocaust education through art and the written word, as you see here on the screen. The written word, the poetry of Avraham Sutzkever, a man I'd never heard of. So I needed to do some research, and I did. And you're looking at what stopped me dead in my tracks. I was reading and listening to his poem, A Cartload of Shoes, and I felt that I discovered a poet that expressed the ethos of Jewish identity as a result of Holocaust endured. Holocaust-endured, one word. He gave poetry to the horror I felt looking at that book, curled up on that sofa as a young girl on that Saturday night a long time ago. And surely more than one poet has captured this essence, but for me, Sutzkever's body of work also addresses nature and resilience, all passions I have. So I wondered, how did I get to my 55th year or 56, I can't do math, without having known this man? And you may know him. He's considered one of the greatest Yiddish poets of his generation, but not to worry if you don't, because unlike novels, poetry seems designed perfectly for reflective revisiting. So today we will honor Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, with the study of this poem that, according to the New York Times, evoked the nightmare of the Holocaust, unquote. So I'm going to read this poem to you. And remember, it was written in Yiddish, so the translations vary. You may also find this poem called A Wagon Load of Shoes. So this is an English translation that you see here. A Cartload of Shoes by Avraham Sutzkever. The wheels hurry onward, onward. What do they carry? They carry a cartload of shivering shoes. The wagon-like canopy in the evening light. The shoes clustered like people in a dance, a wedding, a holiday. Has something blinded my eyes? The shoes. I seem to recognize them. The heels go tapping with a clatter and a din from our old Vilna streets. They drive us to Berlin. I shouldn't ask, but something tears at my tongue. Shoes. Tell me the truth. Where are they? The feet. The feet from those boots with button like dew. And here, where's the body? And there, where's the bride? Where is the child to fill those shoes? And why has the bride gone barefoot? Through the slippers and the boots. I see those my mother used to wear. She kept them for the Sabbath, her favorite pair. And the heels go tapping with the clatter and a din from our old Vilna streets. They drive us to Berlin. Now, I'd like to deconstruct this poem to understand two things: its style and its message. Okay. I'm going to then share a brief biography about Suzkeever, a man who wrote, fought, and risked his life to save books and artwork, not once, but twice, despite death's barrel aiming at destroying his life. And then we will wrap, and I hope you remember Suzkeever's story. Perhaps you'll be inclined to read his work or pen some poetry yourself. The rise of the viral disease of Jewish hatred can only be vaccinated with truth and knowledge. So be inspired by his bravery. Stand up to illogical hatred, just like he did. Okay, so now to decipher this poem, we must understand the symbol of shoes in Holocaust Remembrance. So Hannah, if you could go ahead, maybe one or two slides. There we go. Okay, so in language, shoes, in this case, are an example of something that's called a metonym. So that's a thing that represents a thing. So if I tell you I'm going to the track, you think horse racing. Okay, if I say, oh, he's a suit, then we think of a businessman. And here's a beautiful book by Sloan Wilson, if you've not read it, analyzing the whole idea of the man in the gray flannel suit. When people think of images that capture the Holocaust, many see shoes. Next slide, Hannah. What do shoes represent in our poem? The Suzkeever poem uses shoes to represent the collective whole for the millions of Jewish people murdered. The images we conjure when we read or hear about shoes triggers a reaction of the destruction of the body. These hollowed leather shapes of testimony piled as eternal witness to the pain inflicted on the bodies from which these shoes have been shed. The poem addresses the stolen identities and the individual collected identities of these individuals. Unbuckled, untied, these are trodden death masks, devoid of souls, toes, and feet. Not only are these owners dead, but their bodies have been purposefully destroyed, bulleted, poisoned, burnt, gassed, buried, covered in lime in mass graves, their carbon remnants polluting the skies, billowing from stacks of crematoria. Suzkeever was considered a modernist, and he was part of a new generation of writers whose style rejected the expected structure of poetic form. Holocaust poetry traditionally addressed with a style of lamentation or consolation. This poem is confrontational, questioning the reader, humanity, as if we too are collaborators, responsible for the unlaced leather-creased voids emptied by the methodical banality of evil. Thank you, Hannah Arendt. This confrontational poetry destroys the expected norms of style. Further, the repetition of the questions emphasizes this entropic incomprehensibility of pure hate. Shoes, tell me the truth. Where are the feet? Unanswered questions, too big to comprehend. I would argue because the actions of human beings have outwitted us and our ability to use language to even categorize it. Hannah, could you go ahead to the slide of the individuals walking? Okay. What do these questions imply about the people who once owned these shoes? The feet from those boots with button like dew. And here, where is the body? And there, where is the bride? We know those who own the shoes. They had to remove them themselves. These shoes are witness to their last steps, recording as they were herded like cattle to their deaths. Where is the child to fill the shoes? Why has the bride gone barefoot? He is juxtaposing basic human events that we all experience: walking, tying your shoes, running, dancing, saying I do, with this inconceivable idea that the shoes owners have been rendered dead. Cindy has shown us the images of Ross's carts. We hear the shoes rattle and throb along those cobblestone streets, metonyms of the murdered, victims stumbling from humiliation, overwork, and murder. The heels go tapping with a clatter and a din from our old Vilna streets. They drive us to Berlin. Shouldn't ask, but something tears at my tongue. And here, the poem captures the universal rubbernecker in all of us. We don't want to know. We don't want to look, but we can't help it because it is such a destruction, denuded of language. Next slide, Hannah. So who was Avraham Sutzkever? Poet, partisan. Born in 1913 in a small industrial town located southeast of Vilnius, Lithuania. Next slide, Hannah. Not an ideal location. The Suzkeevers were living in the settlement, the Pale of Settlement, formed in 1791 by Catherine II, a region designated for Russian Jews, as indicated with the blue outline on this map. If you have heard of the term beyond the pale, it has its roots here, as Jewish people needed special dispensation to live beyond the pale. At the end of the 19th century, close to 95% of all of the 5.3 million Jews in the Russian Empire lived there. Next slide, Hannah. 4 years after Avraham was born, the Pale was abolished, but Jewish hatred was not. So the family decided to move to a safer alternative. They went north to Siberia. In Omsk, Hannah, next slide. Maybe it's not there. In Omsk, Avraham's father unfortunately died at the age of 30. So he left behind a young mother with 3 children. So in 1921, they moved back here to Vilna. And FYI, that is a trek of over 2,000 miles. In Vilna, his mother enrolled him in a cheder, which is like a Jewish elementary school. And then he went to a Jewish high school. He audited university classes in Polish Lit. It was there a friend turned him on to Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and introduced him to the beauty of Russian literature. These were good times. This picture of me, people in the library, that is good times. Vilna was experiencing a sophisticated, vibrant, secular Yiddish cultural renaissance. And this library, the Strasham Library, boasted 45,000 volumes. The city earned the nickname the Jerusalem of Lithuania. And it was here that the YIVO Institute was established in 1925 to preserve and study Eastern European Jewish culture and preserve it for the future, much like the libraries do today. Next slide, Hannah. By 1939, YIVO, pictured on the right, held a huge archive of manuscripts, correspondence, photographs, recording, art, folklore, movie posters, more and more, tens of thousands of books, and among them periodicals from all over the world. Culture was pulsating with brilliance and creativity, and it is in this rich atmosphere our poet begins to pen and grow his wings, always flying and filling the pages with his own signature style. Next slide, Hannah. Although he was a member of the many writing and artistic groups, such as Young Viln here, their work lent itself towards the political, but Suzkeever followed on the expansiveness and oneness with nature and the cosmos, maybe influenced by Emerson. And thanks to Cindy, I know he was influenced by Edgar Allan Poe. In 1933, he published his first piece in the Jewish scouting magazine called Bin. And scouting was good to Avraham because it was there that he met his wife Freidke on a scouting expedition. In 1936, he was discovered by the Austrian novelist Joseph Roth, no relation to Philip, as far as I can tell. In 1937, his first book of poems is published, and many of his poems, again, going back to nature. He was published in Warsaw and New York. And the next slide is a visual, an example of his work about his nature and his Siberian experience, and perhaps you can guess the illustrator of this work. Next slide. So Freidke and Avraham marry the day before World War II breaks out, September 1st, 1939. After the Germans and Russians divide Poland, Vilna became known as Vilnius, and it was absorbed into the Soviet Union. In June 1941, the Germans attacked Soviet forces in Eastern Europe, and they occupied Vilna 3 days later. To quote our poet, "And overnight, our thoughts grew gray. The sun sowed poisoned salt on open wounds." And you're looking at images here of the Vilna ghetto, divided into Ghetto 1 and Ghetto 2, the smaller. This very June 22nd, it will be the 80th sad anniversary of this terror. More than 100,000 Jews from Vilna were murdered in the woods of Ponar, just outside of town. The 2,000 remaining were herded into the ghettos you see here and killed off through executions until the last of its occupants were deported or shot by September 43. So went the Suzkeever family into this hell. Avraham could hide for a bit in the crawl space under his mother's home in Ghetto 2 for the infirmed, but he was found, arrested, and set to be executed. but in Dostoevsky style, the Nazis shoot right over his head and then sent him to work. Sickening. It was a sickening summer for the Nazis and its Lithuanian conspirators. Now, the smaller ghetto, Ghetto 2, was packed with dead weight because these people couldn't work. So they were fodder for the beta killing method of Jews that Cindy mentioned, of these mobile killing squads. Now, I just want to speak to you for a brief moment about Lithuania's relationship with Nazi Germany. The Nazis used this country as a testing site to find the best, most efficient way to murder the Jews. I'm not going to go into detail here because it's too much for me. However, I did write a story about this that was published in the Sun Sentinel back in like 1995. And you can access the link that Emily can put in the chat. And it talks about Lithuania's eager collaboration to murder the Jewish people. I know this because my husband's family is from Lithuania. And if you are living in Jacksonville, you know there is a huge Lithuanian population here, the Pushalatters and those from Panovish. And we allegedly went there to do a genealogy adventure, and it ended up being an odyssey of complete hell. We did have some fun times, but I'm saying that I had no idea what was coming my way. And what was coming my way was a statistic. Before the war, Lithuania was home to 265,000 Jewish people. By the end of the war, 95% slaughtered dead. Next picture, Hannah. This is an image of some of the conspirators. And here we have Feces and Suzkeever and some really brave people. So how did Suzkeever survive? He wrote poetry through his ghettoization, capturing Jewish culture and calamity that persisted. So just like Henryk Ross, even amidst death and destruction, or in spite of it, the photographers took pictures, the writers wrote, artists made art, actors acted, musicians composed. And the Vilna ghetto gained a golden reputation as the Jerusalem of ghettos. So despite death, life goes on. There was culture, there was theater, there was a museum, a bookstore, a reading hall, sports center, plays were performed. And while in the ghetto, Avraham and Feces become parents to a baby boy. Jews tried to hide their babies, but the Nazis would find them and poison or strangle them. They weren't worth a bullet. After their son was poisoned, Suzkeever wrote, quote, "I wanted to swallow you, child. When I felt your tiny body cool in my fingers like a glass of warm tea, I wanted to swallow you, child, to taste the future waiting for me. Maybe you will blossom again in my veins. I'm not worthy of you. I can't be your grave. I leave you to the summoning snow, this first respite. You'll descend now, like a splinter of dusk, into the stillness, bringing greetings from me to the slim shoots under the cold." Next slide, Hannah. Entered the Nazi unit called the Eisenstab Rosenberg, with a mission to plunder museums and libraries for art and a future Nazi museum showcasing relics from an extinct race and utilizing Jewish books as resources of academic study for a planned Third Reich university. The Nazis assigned Suzkeever and other writers, poets, intellectuals, artists, to catalog all these precious library and art collections. Can you imagine? this horrible position you put someone in, catalog it for a future sick world, or have it sent to the paper mill, or have it thrown in the pits with the dead bodies. You choose. Hannah, next slide. Within the ghetto, these archivists became known as the Paper Brigade. Now, some of these writers had worked at YIVO before the war. They knew the Germans would eventually destroy YIVO's collections. So they secretly placed rare materials together with the books and artifacts that they chose to save before they were shipped to Germany, believing that although they would not survive, that maybe these precious documents would. They had hope someone would find the documents like a message in a bottle. But that's not all. Suzkeever, along with other Jewish intellectuals, were also at the same time hiding and smuggling books and sculpture and paintings and artworks out of YIVO, out of the Nazis' reach, and hiding them all over town, some even making their way to New York. And they were smuggling in arms. He said, quote, "Books and tatters of text more eternal than marble," unquote, needed to be saved. How brave. Now, who assisted him on this mission? Hannah, next slide. Well, if the partisan resistance song Zog Niet Kamo may sound familiar to you, and I apologize if I've botched the Yiddish, this was the anthem of the Vilna Ghetto resistance movement. Translated, they took the motto, "We will not allow them to take us like sheep to the slaughter." These individuals were aiding the Paper Brigade and rescuing these precious books, art, and documents. And here are the words to their song. I'll just read you the first graph. "Never say that you're going your last way, although the skies fill with lead, cover blue days. Our promised hour will soon come. Our marching steps ring out. Here we are." Next slide, Hannah. Oh, and Emily, if you could put the link to that, on YouTube, there's all these beautiful renditions. If people are interested, they could find it on YouTube, or if Emily can put it in the chat. Now, with the help of partisans like these pictured here in this famous photograph, Suzkeever and his wife escaped the ghetto through Vilna's sewer system on September 13th, 1943, making their way through Lithuania, now the Soviet Union, their dense birch forest, and I never ever looked at a birch tree the same again, surviving minefields. And he describes surviving these minefields by crossing with a poetic rhythm to avoid death. And just days later, the ghetto was destroyed and its inhabitants deported to their deaths. While fighting with the partisans in the forest, he continued to write poetry. And he says in the preface of Lieder, quote, "Poems from the Sea of Death," unquote, "When the very sun became like ashes, I believe with perfect faith, as long as poetry does not abandon me, lead me or not destroy me, as long as I live my life as a poet in the valley of the shadow of death, my sufferings will merit tikkun, repair, and redemption," unquote. My message to you: never underestimate the strength and inspiration that comes from putting pen to paper. Next slide. Talk about strength and resilience. This man did not stop. Connecting Stalin, Dr. Zhivago, James Bond, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and I would even argue Mark Twain. For example, Stalin and Dr. Zhivago and Bond. His 1943 poem, Kol Nidre, which refers to one of the holiest nights in the Jewish calendar, made its way to Moscow through this resistance network, and it gained the attention of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, led by poet Ilya Ehrenberg and Dr. Zhivago author Boris Pasternak. They implored and advocated at the Kremlin with Stalin for a Suzkeever rescue operation. And so it was. A plan was executed and a rescue operation engaged with a planned airlift in an airstrip out in the woods in Russia to extract the couple. And would you believe it or not, the first plane crashes. So a second one is sent, transporting the Suzkeevers, ferrying them to Moscow. And you see this picture here. Next year, there's the family Suzkeever with their daughter, Rena. Still, Suzkeever's work does not stop. Determined, like Mr. Smith goes to Washington, but this is for real. A month after we see their daughter here born, he wrote the first official article ever printed in the Soviet Union detailing the murderous atrocities of the Nazis as witnessed by Suzkeever. Hannah, next slide. It should be a slide of Pravda. Now, I don't read Russian and I couldn't find the exact edition, but here is an example for you of what Pravda looked like then and where his article would have appeared. In addition, after the war, he served as a witness in the Nuremberg trials. He wanted to give his testimony in Yiddish, but he had to deliver it in Russian. Hannah, next slide. In the Jewish faith, it is customary to stand while reciting Kaddish, which is a prayer honoring loved ones gone. So if you watch the Suzkeever Nuremberg trials, and there's several, just go on YouTube, you can find them. You will see that Suzkeever, he stood for the entire testimony. So what happened after the war in relation to Suzkeever? Of the 60,000 Jews in Vilna, only a few hundred actually end up surviving after the war. The next slide shows the ruins that the paper brigade and the resistance fighters were able to retrieve and exhume. Hidden literature, artistic treasures, all secreted away, including etchings of Chagall and Theodore Herzl's diary. You may have seen the film, The Rape of Europa. Well, like the Monument Men, next slide, we have our monument couple of Mr. and Mrs. Suzkeever looking over rescued treasures delivered to Moscow. And if you look at the image on your right, you will see Suzkeever on your left. And in the cart, there is a bust. And that, my friend, is Leo Tolstoy. Today, many of the materials now are in YIVO in New York. Much of it did remain in Lithuania and was only discovered with the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Interestingly, in the 1990s, they were still discovering hidden pieces. There is an excellent book called The Book Thieves. By Anders Rydell. It's a great translation. And the story I'm telling you this evening is just one of many about how the Nazis tried to rewrite history by hijacking and commandeering our precious books and destroying them. Hannah, next slide. Oh, there's a copy of the book. Okay. Unfortunately, Suzkeever and his remaining paper brigade friends had to rescue the books yet again when then the Soviet Union decided that they'd have a turn in narrating and writing their own history. And they were bent on sending everything to the paper mills. Finally, in 1969, in the photo you see here, I call this Suzkeever my Mark Twain. Here he is in Israel. seated second from the right, with his surviving partisan friends. And I am almost sure they're speaking in Yiddish. See, Suzkeever emerged after the war as an Israeli national poet and is considered one of the greatest Jewish poets of the 20th century, responsible for influencing a Yiddish revival. And if Goldie Lansky is with us this evening, her dear cousin Erin of the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, probably would have a lot more to say about our hero, Suzkeever. Now, this was no easy task, reviving a language. You must understand that language is what holds together groups, countries, identities. And Suzkeever, this man did not fit into the mold of the pioneering Israeli Sabra. As Zionism took hold in Europe and Jewish people made their way to establish an autonomous state free of threat and hate in Israel, they wanted to leave their old ways behind. But in Israel, Suzkeever remained a fervent advocate for Yiddish as an integral part of the Jewish people's expression and identity. He assumed a public role with the message that Yiddish language and culture would continue to thrive and will hold the Jewish people together. But Yiddish was seen as old school. Next slide. Suzkeever would say au contraire, or maybe he would say that's Gornish. Shedding the old ways, really though, isn't it a normal part of growing up? These young pioneers decided that Hebrew should become the language of the new Jewish home. Now, if you've watched Netflix, the series Shtisel, you will see, or if you listen closely, you will hear that the characters are speaking Yiddish. And they curse the Zionist heathen Israelis that dared to speak Hebrew, which the Haredim, these very religious Jews portrayed in this series, reserve only for sacred prayer. But way before Shtisel, we had Suzkeever. Next slide, Hannah. So today, Suzkeever's works are translated from the Yiddish to English, Swedish, French, Hebrew, Polish, etc., etc. His wife died in 2003, leaving him and 2 surviving daughters. Suzkeever passed away in 2010 at 96 years young. I want to wrap and go back to a cartload of shoes. Remember, we discussed the symbolism and the term metonym. Look at your own shoes. I bet your shoes right now could tell a lot about you. Piled in the cart to which Avraham refers, he sees the pile, probably forcibly collected and loaded and then dragged through the ghetto by imprisoned laborers, as a sociopathic sick stunt by the Nazis. We learn in this poem what shoes represent, but it doesn't end here. Suzkeever is also a reporter. He is truly reporting on the murder of his own mother, who was killed early on as she was in ghetto number 2. So today, I like to look at this program as an act of remembrance, a way for all of us gathered to give our own original act of Kaddish and remembrance to Avraham's mother and all the murdered who had mothers. And isn't that all of us? The shoes and poem stand as a cautionary tale of what hate can do to humankind. Thank you. Cindy.
Stacey.
Yes.
Fantastic, as usual.
You know what? I haven't looked at the chat, but I see it scrolling, and I want to thank people so much for attending. I want to also thank Hannah and Emily and Kara and Carrie and Andrea and everyone at the Cummer.
Yes,
for,
thank you all.
Yeah, just thank you so much. Cindy, do you have anything you want to wrap before we go?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it was pretty comprehensive. I mean, Suzkeever, I have a whole new appreciation of Suzkeever now. I mean,
And
what a
myself,
life.
myself, Ross. You know, there is this book we could recommend also to people, Memory Unearthed, which has all of the Suzkeever photographs, and of course, the book
Right.
Thief. Of course, I'm always going to recommend books.
Right.
But
I
don't
hope we did Holocaust Remembrance proud, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I just want to thank everyone then, and I'll take us out by saying we appreciate you being here as your own act of remembrance. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.